It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We're still deep into our catch-up of our stories, as my mom or grandma would say when watching their soaps. Yes, I need a little bit of an easier go of things for these next couple of months, so I decided to turn on the boob tube and catch up on some shows I've covered before and some shows I have been meaning to crack open but just haven't yet. But this week, we're making a last stop for a visit with an old friend before we head off into new, uncharted waters. Yep, it's time to return to Rod Serling's Night Gallery. Now, if you've listened over the last couple of weeks while I revisited Tales from the Dark Side and Ultra Q, I covered 3 episodes of each of those series, and it makes sense. I do this show where I always have, 3 things that I like about whatever movie or show I'm discussing, but with shows like that being in half-hour formats, it was best to kind of keep one like per episode. I talked about an episode, I delivered a like, and I'll be doing that to a certain extent this week as well. This 3rd episode of Night Gallery aired on December 30th, 1970, and while the 2nd episode that I previously covered had 3 segments, this episode only has 2. However, I'm still going to offer a single like per story. My 3rd like to round out this episode will go to something else. So I'll still be doing 3 likes, but I still limited each story getting a single like as to not have one segment be more weighted than the other, if any of that makes sense. I don't know. It makes sense to me, and I think it'll be much clearer by the end of this episode you're listening to. Now, before I delve into this episode's first segment, understand that much like with Tales from the Dark Side, Night Gallery didn't always have something that worked particularly well for what I'd like to do with Monster Mondays. Depending on what other episodes come up sequentially in the series, I may have to jump around a bit. And instead of doing an actual episode and cover each segment, maybe I'll, mix and match segments across 2 or 3 episodes in the future, or possibly just jump around the episode numbering or whatever. We'll figure that out when I one day return to this series in particular. So let's get into episode 3 of Night Gallery, and the first of 2 stories in this episode called The House. Joanna Pettit plays a woman who has a series of recurring dreams about a house. It's not a nightmare, but kind of a soothing feeling to drive up to the house, arrive at the front door, and knock on it. And she's drawn to the house and wants to go to the house and knock on that door, but she has no idea what to do if someone actually answers. Now, typically, no one does answer, and she gets back into the car and drives away. But something does answer the front door of the house, but only once she gets to the end of the driveway. She knows someone opens the door, but she continues driving away. Now, while speaking to her therapist and psychologist, she says she has no idea where the house is. She has no memory of ever seeing it, and she's had the dream for at least 10 years, and that's why she remembers the dream so vividly. But we also learned that she is currently staying in a sanitarium. She's suffering from anxiety and depression, but she's been deemed cured and she is leaving the next day. An older patient at the hospital is happy to see her leave. She thinks the young woman is too flighty and dreams too much. And as it turns out, the old lady is reading a magazine about a haunted house. The house in our lead character Elaine Latimer's dream. Almost right away after checking out of the sanitarium, Elaine finds herself on the road in her dream and in the driveway of the house of her dreams. Compelled, she approaches the front door, and a man steps out from the shadows in the front of the house, saying that the house is for sale and Elaine will be the first to see the house since it's been listed. As he shows her around, she describes exactly what it is inside the various rooms without ever actually being inside before. It's like she's intimately familiar with every detail of the house. And she learns the sellers are very motivated to sell, as they've moved back to England. They were originally from England, and has listed the house for 5 times less than what it's worth. The reason for that is that anyone who has ever lived in the house claim it is haunted. No one knows who haunts the place. There was never any kind of violence or death that took place in the house. The owners cannot describe what the ghost or apparition looks like that is supposedly in the house. They just know it's haunted. Elaine, excited that the house kind of has this story to it, it's something she's familiar with already, and that it's so cheap, excitedly buys the house on the spot. The real estate broker even says that Elaine is a woman of resolve and will, 2 words that's never been associated with her before. Even after moving in, Elaine continues to dream the same dream, but this time she wakes up to hearing a knock on the door and hearing a car drive away that she can't see before she can answer the door. When she calls her therapist to give him the update that she found her house and that she bought it and she seems to be doing well and she's even excited that it's haunted, the knock comes to the door again, so she tells the doctor to hold on, and she goes downstairs. She answers the front door. She lets out kind of an frightened scream, a very brief, muddled and muffled scream. And when she returns to the phone, she tells the doctor that she has discovered that she herself is the ghost. Her dream self is the one who comes to the door. The ghost of herself visits the real version of herself multiple times a day, but never stays and never explains itself. It drives up to the door, knocks, and drives away before Elaine can meet it. She will basically be forever haunted by the dream and by the dream visiting her in real life. So it's almost like if she leaves, she'll have the recurring dream. If she stays, she will become part of that dream. Now, what I like about the house is kind of interesting, because the story offers zero explanation or resolution to what it's actually really about. Did Elaine die 10 years ago and she's trapped between the physical world and some intangible one? Did the dream lead her to her own fate of buying the house? Is the ghost only taking on her appearance? Did it do the same thing to the previous owners? Is any of this real? Is she trapped in kind of a limbo state where she's continuously reliving this period of her life? The old lady seems to think that Elaine is flighty and always going here and there like she has never been grounded to anything. That alone seems to make you think that maybe Elaine is indeed a ghost and no longer a real person. It's not a particularly strong story because it does lack that conclusive or satisfactory explanation of what Elaine's deal is and what it means that she is her own ghost, but the nuggets are there to keep you thinking about what the answer is. And even though I'm still thinking about it and trying to puzzle through the answer to the mystery, I'm not annoyed by it. So the strength does come from being engaged enough to make you want to think about what the ultimate meaning of all of this is. It's almost like dream logic in that way. And now we're going to move on to the second segment of this episode, titled Certain Shadows on the Wall. In this segment, we meet a pair of siblings. The sister Emma is on her deathbed while her younger brother Stephen, a doctor, cares for her. She consistently wants Stephen to read Great Expectations and other Dickens novels to her, and she always speaks of wanting more life, things that Stephen either is tiring of or cannot provide her. Stephen is kind of turning out to be something of a sinister character. Emma was left the house by their parents, and Stephen has his own opinions why their father specifically did that, by claiming that Emma was clingy, and this was almost a payment for him to be allowed to pass away. But he's kind of the outsider of the family. While he does have a successful medical practice, he quarrels with his 2 younger sisters, Anne and Rebecca, and he kind of holds it over them that he has something more than the sisters to go back to when Emma passes away. Once Emma dies, Anne and Rebecca maybe won't have a place to go. However, they recognize that Stephen also has a gambling vice, and quite a large one. So he's kind of, so it kind of looks like to them that he's looking forward to his sister's death so that he can kind of cash in and fuel his gambling vices even more. But sure enough, the time has come. Emma passes away that very night. And at the time of her death, the clock in the hall stops. The house is now left to be kind of taken over by the surviving siblings, split 3 ways evenly. And as Stephen calls to have the body picked up for funeral services, Anne is shocked to discover a shadow now being cast on the wall that is the perfect silhouette of Emma. But the shadow isn't really a shadow. Stephen is slowly being driven nuts by the fact that no matter how he arranges lighting or the furniture is arranged, there is no changing the image on the wall. It's almost like it's burned into the wall instead of being cast onto it. Anne begins to realize that perhaps the shadow is there to haunt Stephen. Stephen's diagnosis of Emma's death may actually be more of an alibi for him. Maybe he's been slowly poisoning her to death. Stephen even tries to paint over the shadow, but it doesn't help. It still stays on the surface of the wall. Later, Rebecca reveals that she found the so-called sedatives that Stephen used to give to Emma each night to help her sleep better. And Rebecca tells Anne that she ground up some of the pills and put it into the tea that she prepared for Stephen, and the sisters are rather excited to no longer have their scheming brother around. However, it turns out that the siblings will always be united, as the shadow of Stephen has now joined the shadow of Emma on the wall. My like for certain shadows on the wall is kind of the old-timey, almost gothic feel of this family living together in this kind of old, dusty estate that, and already is kind of fairly lifeless, really. We have a family of siblings that represent the kind of stereotypical wealthy family who aren't very loving to one another. That creates the sniping and bickering back and forth between the siblings. It's very literary in the sense that it just feels like a classic short story. And it was. It was based on a short story from writer Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. She was known for writing a lot of ghost stories, and Shadows on the Wall was one of them. Considering her career began in the late 19th century and carried over into the early 20th, this story has that same feel to it. It has that feeling of being from that era. However, to be perfectly honest, my favorite thing about this is going to be, by default, Grayson Hall playing one of the sisters, Anne. No matter what I've ever seen her in, I just love her kind of cold coolness and almost detachment that kind of strikes an image for her. Like if you see her, you know that she means business and she will make sure to stand her ground against some jerk off giving her lip. In this case, it was her brother giving her lip. And you almost expect her to be the one who gets that final revenge. But there is that lovely twist that the youngest, most innocent sister, Rebecca, is the one who gets rid of their problem brother. All of those relationships between the siblings make for this being a fun little short story about quarreling siblings and how you can never really free yourself from family, especially when you're behind their demise. And as for my third like, since I am kind of going outside of the two stories, I want to give my appreciation for the presentation of the series Night Gallery. I feel like this is what makes the show enticing to viewers, even if the series ultimately was never able to live up to the high bar Serling set with The Twilight Zone. The eerie images of the opening title sequence, the black box style set that served as Serling's titular night gallery that he walked through, and the off-kilter or flat-out spooky images captured in the paintings themselves all serve to at least set the mood properly for each episode. Serling's introductions are also exactly what you wanted from the man who presented the strange and weird worlds and scenarios of The Twilight Zone. But here he comes off almost sinister. He's almost referring to the images, portraits, and pieces almost as if he's trying to sell them to you in a way that maybe a devil or another trickster would be selling the idea to you. And I've talked about how eerie the opening and closing narrations were for me to hear as a kid whenever I caught an episode of the Tales from the Dark Side series. But Night Gallery kind of has that same effect. It's just off of the norm, just enough to be a little unsettling, and it never really fails to work, even if some of the stories weren't always as interesting as they could be. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at FilmSeizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky so that you can find out when new episodes come along. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. And we also upload those to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, we are sticking with Rod Serling because it's time to finally take a trip into the Twilight Zone. And what better way to take that trip than hop on an airplane with William Shatner as he experiences the nightmare at 20,000 feet. Until next week, stay spooky.